What Jonathan Roumie just said about Jesus left Senator John Kennedy in tears. And what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about faith in America. The studio lights blaze down on the set of Faith and Future, casting an almost ethereal glow over the two burgundy leather chairs positioned at a careful angle, their rich mahogany surfaces gleaming under the meticulous attention of a production crew that seemed unusually quiet, unusually focused. There was something different in the air tonight, something that made even the most seasoned cameramen pause and check their equipment twice, as if they sensed they were about to capture something that would be talked about for years to come. In one chair sat Jonathan Roumie, the man who had brought Jesus Christ to life for millions of viewers worldwide through The Chosen, his hands resting peacefully in his lap, his dark eyes carrying a depth that seemed to see beyond the studio walls into something eternal. His usual Hollywood composure was softened by an almost monastic stillness, as if he carried the weight of portraying the Son of God, not just as a role, but as a sacred responsibility that had fundamentally changed who he was. Across from him, Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana shifted slightly, his trademark sharp wit momentarily subdued by an anticipation he couldn't quite name, his fingers drumming once against the armrest before falling still as he studied the man who had made Jesus feel real to a generation. The floor director's countdown seemed to stretch forever. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And suddenly they were live to millions of homes across America, unaware that they were about to witness something that would force one of Washington's sharpest minds to confront a truth so profound it would leave him weeping on national television. "Good evening and welcome to Faith and Future," began host Rebecca Chen, her voice carrying an unusual gravity as she addressed the camera directly. "Tonight, we bring you something unprecedented. The man who portrays Jesus Christ in the most watched biblical series in history sits down with one of America's most quotable senators for a conversation that, I promise you, will end in a way none of us saw coming." Rebecca's heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she moved away from the cameras, leaving the two men alone in their circle of light. And Kennedy turned to Roumie with a mixture of curiosity and that particular vulnerability that comes when you're about to ask a question you're not sure you're ready to hear answered. "Jonathan," Kennedy began, his southern drawl carrying none of its usual political calculation, "I've got to ask you something that's been on my mind since I heard about this conversation. You spend your days literally embodying Jesus Christ, speaking his words, walking in his footsteps, becoming him for millions of people. But here's what I want to know, and I hope you'll be straight with me. When the cameras stop rolling and you take off those robes, do you ever feel like a fraud?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and transformative, and Roumie's response would prove to be so unexpected, so raw, so devastating in its honesty, that it would strip away every defense Kennedy had ever built around his own faith and leave him crying tears he never saw coming. But what Roumie was about to reveal about his relationship with Jesus, about the moment that changed everything during filming, about the conversation he had with God that no one was supposed to hear, would do more than move a senator to tears. It would expose a truth about faith, about calling, about the price of truly following Christ that most people spend their entire lives running from. And by the time this conversation ended, both men would be forever changed. Roumie's eyes closed for a moment, and when they opened, there was something there that Kennedy had never seen before. Not in any actor, not in any politician, not even in most preachers. It was the look of a man who had been broken and rebuilt, who had stared into the face of divinity and come away forever scarred by the beauty of it. "Senator," Roumie said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow filling the entire studio. "That's exactly what I felt for the first 2 years of filming. Every morning I'd wake up and think, who am I to speak the words of the Son of God? Who am I to look into those cameras and try to convey the love that created the universe? I was terrified that people would see through me, that they'd realize I was just an actor from New York trying to play the most important person who ever lived. Kennedy leaned forward, his usual sharpness replaced by something gentler, more human. "So, what changed, Jonathan? Because when I watch you on screen, I don't see an actor. I see something else, something that makes me believe." Roumie's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the water glass beside his chair, and for a moment, the only sound in the studio was the quiet hum of the cameras, capturing every breath, every pause, every moment of this conversation that was about to shatter everything Kennedy thought he knew about faith and calling. "It was during the filming of the Sermon on the Mount," Roumie began, his voice growing stronger as he spoke, as if the memory itself was giving him courage. "We had 8,000 extras on that hillside, all of them looking at me, waiting for Jesus to speak. I was standing there in those robes, the wind picking up, the sun setting behind me, and suddenly I felt this overwhelming terror. Not stage fright, Senator. Terror. Because I realized that in that moment, I wasn't just representing Jesus to a camera crew or even to the millions who would eventually watch. I was representing him to 8,000 people who were looking at me and seeing the face of God." The camera operator zoomed in slightly, catching the intensity building in Roumie's eyes, the way his voice began to carry the weight of revelation. I started to panic. My heart was racing, my palms were sweating, and I thought about running off that hill, telling everyone I couldn't do it. But then something happened that I've never told anyone. Not the directors, not my family, not even my priest. Kennedy's breathing seemed to stop. His eyes locked on Roumie's face, as if he could sense that whatever came next would change everything. "I heard a voice, Senator. Not audible, but clearer than anything I'd ever heard in my life. And it said, 'Jonathan, you think this is about you. You think I chose you because you're worthy, because you're good enough, because you're holy enough. But I chose you because you're broken enough. I chose you because when people see you portraying me, they won't see your perfection. They'll see my love working through your brokenness.'" Roumie's voice cracked slightly, his eyes glistening as he continued. "And then I understood something that shattered me completely. God doesn't call the qualified, Senator. He qualifies the called. Every prophet, every apostle, every person he ever used was flawed, was broken, was completely inadequate for the task." Kennedy's hand moved to his chest, his eyes widening as something deep inside him began to shift, began to crack open like a dam that had been holding back years of self-doubt and unworthiness. Moses had a speech impediment and murdered a man. David was an adulterer and a murderer. Peter denied Christ 3 times when it mattered most. Paul persecuted Christians before becoming the greatest missionary in history. And me? I'm just an actor who struggled with addiction, who made a mess of relationships, who felt lost for most of his life. But that's exactly why God could use me. Because when people see Jesus through me, they know it's not Jonathan Roumie they're seeing. It's the love of God working through someone who knows he doesn't deserve it. The studio had fallen into a reverent silence, the crew members standing motionless, many of them visibly moved by the raw honesty pouring out of this man who had become Jesus for millions. Kennedy's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke, his southern composure completely stripped away. "Jonathan, I think you just explained something I've been wrestling with my entire career. I've always felt like if people really knew who I was, if they knew my failures, my doubts, my moments of weakness, they'd realize I have no business being in the Senate, no business trying to serve anyone." His eyes were filling with tears now, his voice breaking slightly. "But you're saying that's exactly why God might be able to use me?" Roumie leaned forward, his own eyes bright with unshed tears, his voice gentle but firm. "Senator, the most powerful moment in all 4 seasons of The Chosen wasn't when I performed a miracle or gave a profound teaching. It was when I portrayed Jesus weeping over Jerusalem, when I showed him broken-hearted over the people he loved who couldn't see his love for them. That's when viewers wrote to us saying, "I finally understood that Jesus knows what it's like to hurt." The power wasn't in the perfection, Senator. It was in the brokenness made beautiful by love. Kennedy reached for a tissue, no longer caring about his image or his reputation, completely undone by this revelation that was rewiring everything he thought he knew about worthiness and calling and the heart of God. But what happened next would become the moment that millions of viewers would replay over and over, the moment that would be shared across every social media platform, the moment that would forever change how America saw both faith and politics. Roumie studied Kennedy's face, seeing something there that the cameras couldn't quite capture yet, a dam that was about to burst, a lifetime of carefully constructed walls that were crumbling in real time. "Senator," Roumie said quietly, his voice carrying the gentleness of someone who had learned to speak as Jesus would speak. "Can I tell you what I think Jesus would say to you right now, in this moment, sitting in this chair?" Kennedy nodded, unable to speak, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair, as if he was bracing himself for impact. The studio lights seemed to dim everything except the space between these two men, the cameras capturing every micro-expression, every breath, every heartbeat of what was about to unfold. I think he would say, "John, my beloved son, you have spent your entire life trying to prove you're worthy of love, worthy of respect, worthy of the calling I placed on your life. You've used your wit as armor and your intelligence as a shield, thinking that if you could just be clever enough, sharp enough, good enough, then maybe you'd deserve the grace I freely give." Kennedy's composure began to crack visibly, his eyes filling with tears as Roumie continued, his voice never rising above a whisper, but somehow carrying the weight of divine truth. "But John, you were chosen before you took your first breath. You were loved before you cast your first vote. You were called before you ever stepped foot in Washington. Not because of your qualifications, but because of my love. Not because you're perfect, but because I am. And every sharp word you've ever spoken in defense of the helpless, every stand you've taken for justice, every moment you've fought for the forgotten, that's been me working through your brokenness." The tears were flowing freely down Kennedy's face now, his Southern dignity completely abandoned as years of self-doubt and unworthiness came pouring out. "Jonathan," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "I've spent 50 years in public service thinking I had to earn God's approval with every vote, every speech, every decision. I thought if I could just do enough good, maybe I'd be worthy of the calling. But you're telling me it was never about earning it at all." Roumie's own tears began to fall as he leaned forward, his hand reaching across the space between their chairs. "Senator, the most powerful scene I ever filmed wasn't when Jesus performed a miracle. It was when he looked at Peter after the denial, after Peter had failed him completely, and the look in his eyes wasn't disappointment or anger. It was love. Unchanged, unshakable, unconditional love. That's the look he has for you right now, John. Not because of what you've accomplished, but because you're his." Kennedy broke completely then, sobbing openly as the weight of a lifetime of trying to earn what had already been freely given crashed down on him. The crew stood transfixed, many of them weeping themselves as they witnessed something sacred unfolding before their cameras. "I've been so afraid," Kennedy choked out between sobs. "So afraid that if people really knew me, if God really saw me, they'd realize I'm just a broken man from Louisiana who doesn't deserve any of this. But you're saying that's exactly why he chose me?" "John," Roumie said, his voice thick with emotion, "when I put on those robes every day, I'm not pretending to be perfect. I'm allowing perfect love to work through imperfect me. That's what you've been doing in the Senate all these years, whether you realized it or not. Every time you've stood up for justice with that sharp tongue of yours, Every time you've used your platform to defend the defenseless, that's been Jesus working through John Kennedy's brokenness to touch a broken world. The cameras captured it all, the complete transformation of one of Washington's toughest senators into a man overwhelmed by the radical reality of unconditional love. Kennedy looked up at Roumie through his tears, his voice shaking with wonder. "So, when I go back to Washington tomorrow, when I walk into that Senate chamber, I don't have to carry the weight of proving myself anymore? I can just be the broken instrument he chooses to use." Roumie smiled through his own tears, and for a moment, the millions watching at home could swear they were seeing the face of Jesus himself. "John, that's not just permission to be broken. That's the secret to being powerful. When we stop trying to be strong enough and start allowing His strength to work through our weakness, that's when miracles happen. That's when senators become prophets, and actors become vessels, and broken people become the hands and feet of God." The studio fell into complete silence, except for the quiet sounds of two men weeping, not in despair, but in the overwhelming relief of finally understanding that they had never needed to earn what had always been freely given. And in that moment, everyone watching knew they had witnessed something that would change not just these two men, but everyone who had been brave enough to watch love break down every wall that pride and fear had ever built. As the emotional weight of the moment settled, Roumie reached across and gently placed his hand on Kennedy's shoulder, his voice soft but filled with purpose. "John, this revelation we've just experienced, it can't stay in this studio. When I walk onto the chosen set tomorrow, I'm going to remember that I'm not acting anymore. I'm allowing Jesus to love people through me. And when you walk into that Senate chamber, you're not going to be performing politics. You're going to be allowing God's heart for justice to flow through your voice." Kennedy wiped his eyes, his composure returning but forever changed, his voice carrying a new depth of conviction. "Jonathan, you've given me something tonight that I didn't even know I was searching for. Permission to be broken and still be used. But what does that look like practically? How do we live this truth when the cameras stop rolling and the real world hits us again?" Roumie's eyes lit up with the passion of someone who had found his true calling. It starts with remembering that every person we encounter is someone Jesus died for. When you're debating in the Senate, you're not just talking to opponents. You're talking to people God loves desperately. When I'm on set, I'm not just delivering lines to actors. I'm speaking words of life to souls who need to know they're valued. He paused, looking directly into the camera. And for everyone watching tonight, whether you're in Hollywood, Washington, or anywhere in between, God isn't waiting for you to get your act together. He's waiting to work through your brokenness right now. Kennedy nodded, standing up from his chair, his transformation complete. If God can use a broken actor to show millions who Jesus really is, and if He can use a broken senator to fight for justice, then He can use anyone watching this. The question isn't whether you're qualified. The question is whether you're willing to let perfect love work through imperfect you. The cameras captured both men standing together, no longer strangers, but brothers united in the beautiful truth that God's greatest power is revealed through human weakness, and that the most broken vessels often carry the most precious treasure. As the studio lights began to dim, signaling the end of their time together, Kennedy turned to Roumie one final time, his voice steady, but filled with wonder. "Jonathan, when people ask me what happened here tonight, what should I tell them? How do I explain that watching you portray Jesus didn't just entertain me? It completely transformed how I see my calling." Roumie smiled, his eyes still bright with tears, but now shining with hope. "Tell them that Jesus isn't looking for perfect people to use. He's looking for willing people to love through. Tell them that whether you're an actor, a senator, a teacher, or a parent, God's greatest miracles happen when we stop trying to be enough and start letting His love be enough through us." Kennedy nodded, extending his hand to Roumie, but instead of a handshake, Roumie pulled him into an embrace that spoke of brotherhood forged in divine truth. "Thank you," Kennedy whispered, "for showing me that I don't have to carry the weight of being worthy anymore. I can just carry his love." As the cameras captured this final moment, Roumie looked directly into the lens, speaking to the millions watching at home. If a broken actor can portray the Son of God, and if a doubting senator can become a vessel of grace, then God can use anyone. The question isn't whether you're qualified. The question is whether you'll say yes to being His hands, His voice, His love in a world that desperately needs to know they're worth dying for. The studio fell silent as the credits began to roll, but the impact of what had just transpired would echo far beyond these walls, proving that sometimes the most powerful sermons aren't preached from pulpits, but lived out in the beautiful brokenness of two people brave enough to let God's love transform them on national television. In the days that followed this extraordinary conversation, something unprecedented began to happen across America. Senator Kennedy returned to Washington not as the sharp-tongued politician the media expected, but as a man carrying a new understanding of grace that began transforming every speech, every vote, every interaction with colleagues who couldn't understand what had changed in him. His staff reported that he had started each morning not with political briefings, but with quiet prayer, asking not how to win the day's battles, but how to love people through them. Meanwhile, Roumie returned to the Chosen set with a deeper reverence for his calling. But more importantly, he began receiving thousands of messages from viewers who had watched the Faith and Future conversation. Parents writing about how they had stopped trying to be perfect for their children and started showing them what grace looks like. Business leaders describing how they had begun treating employees not as resources, but as souls made in God's image. Teachers sharing stories of seeing their students not as test scores, but as precious individuals worthy of patient love. The conversation had done something that neither man expected. It had given people permission to be beautifully broken, to stop performing worthiness, and start living loved. Churches across the country began playing clips from the interview, not as entertainment, but as a masterclass in what authentic faith looks like when it stops hiding behind religious language and starts speaking the language of the heart. And perhaps most powerfully, the interview had created a new template for public discourse, proving that vulnerability could be stronger than invincibility, that admitting brokenness could be more powerful than projecting perfection, and that sometimes the most important conversations happen not when we have all the answers, but when we're brave enough to ask the questions that reveal our deepest need for grace. The ripple effects of one honest conversation between a broken actor and a transformed senator continued to spread, touching lives neither man would ever meet, but both would forever be grateful to have reached.